Do you think Ohio State earns the drop in ranking with the flip flop? Michigan State bumping them up to 5, putting Ohio State down to 6.
I don't know if Ohio State earned it more so than Michigan State did their part. They're
Sure.
undefeated. They've got a better win than Ohio State has on their resume, and they've got a game breaker, difference maker type of running back, and so that's getting a lot of eyeballs for them. And I think Ohio State's in a really good spot because they have that team on their schedule still, and they can build into a big game versus the Spartans as long as everybody handles their business the way they're supposed to. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not a bad spot. I have no expectations for Ohio State to be in the first college football playoff ranking in the top 4 there, but they don't have to be. If I was ranking them right now, I'd have at least 4 teams ahead of them, and then there's the Oregon question with the head-to-head there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I remember back in 14 when my team won it all, we were sitting at like 16 when the first ranking came out. So
Yeah.
it's not impossible to elevate and be in, a top 6 team as of right now is a really good spot. And so my mentality for this Ohio State team is they lost their margin of error, but they have the opportunity to continue to build. And they're bringing along some young players, both offensively and defensively, that have really stepped up. And as long as they win the 2 big ones left on their schedule and they don't drop any ugly ones to Purdue or Nebraska, it's all right in front of them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm actually going to attend the Purdue game, and I'm terrified because Purdue, like, they did it to Iowa. Now it turns out that's a different story. Iowa's defense is, I think I could score more than Iowa's offense right now. But you're right. Like, obviously the Michigan State and the Michigan games are the 2 that you really highlight if you're Ohio State. But yeah, don't sleep on Nebraska or Purdue. I do have to ask you, as a former player, that 2014 game you're well known for at Penn State in the Whiteout, you had 18 tackles in that game. But I want to know from a player's perspective, because it looks crazy on TV, but what is it like playing at Penn State during a Whiteout?
As advertised. And it's interesting because I talked to some national college football analysts and, specifically color commentary because they're on location. I ask them about these environments because I haven't, seen a game at Alabama and I haven't seen a game at Kyle Field and, some of these historic big stadiums. And Kirk Herbstreit actually told me this. He said that if you go to LSU at night, it's probably a louder environment. He said there's nothing like a whiteout at Penn State because of the buy-in. He said it's the most electric, most committed environment that you will see in college football. And playing in that stadium, I can confirm it was not even close, the best atmosphere. And this is probably going to piss some Buckeye fans off, but I think it's better than a night game in the shoe. It's just one of those things that I don't think you can really replicate.
Since we are on the other team conversation, what are your main takeaways from, I suppose, Michigan State? Obviously, big win for Michigan State. And specifically, maybe how hot is Harbaugh's seat right now? Like, how much more do you think Michigan can take with not really even breaking 500 against their main rivals? So
it's interesting. So to recap the game, I think Michigan did enough things to win the football game, right? You're talking about 552 yards of total offense. Cade McNamara threw the ball the best he's ever thrown it. And I actually made this comment on a podcast I do with Christian Hackenberg, but we both agreed that the Michigan offense wasn't necessarily allowing Cade to be as explosive as he was on Saturday. I don't think this was a situation where the quarterback played out of his mind and, this is an aberration of a game. I think this is something that Michigan could do if they just allowed their offense to be like that. And they kind of rode the wave on it. But they also had a couple of crucial mistakes. Obviously, the McCarthy-Corum exchange was a big swing in the game. And those types of things can lose you games, but they were in control. This is the thing about Michigan State, though, is they have a coach who lacks a conscience when it comes to taking risk, right? On the fourth downs that they had, they weren't just trying to convert the fourth downs. They were going for the freaking end zone. And they were big plays in the game. And they were getting burned. Their secondary was getting burned. Dudes were getting run by. And Mel Tucker's response to that was, let's just keep blitzing them because at some point we're going to affect the game by getting pressure on the quarterback and force him into some questionable throws, which on I think it was one of the fourth downs that Michigan had gone for. the one that people thought was pass interference, if Cade McNamara would have thrown the out instead of the route that was coming in, the shallow crosser, he probably would have completed the pass, but he was under duress, so he couldn't do it. And then you look at the final play of the game, like it was one of those things where you just see the aggression of the players. They're breaking on the ball. You had one guy hitting the tight end, another guy there to make the interception. That is Mel Tucker, and that is the antithesis of Jim Harbaugh. He's a guy who I feel like has lacked that killer instinct, that ability to close out games. And so for his future, it's interesting because I talked to a couple of Michigan people about this over the weekend just to hear the responses. And one person said, this is who Jim Harbaugh is. He's not going to beat his rivals. He's just going to win 10 games and get close enough, but he's never going to win the East. He's never going to make the playoff. It is literally time to move on. I talked to another person who said, well, let's see how this season shapes up, because if they're able to go 10-2 in the regular season and not get embarrassed by Ohio State and make it to a New Year's Six game as an at-large, then we're cooking here. Then you feel like that's something to build off of. Then you feel like the recruiting is paying off and they're going to put themselves in a position into the future. Two completely different points of view. And it's a unique situation that Michigan's sitting on right now, because you have a coach who is lightly committed due to his buyout if he leaves. You're lightly committed to him due to the buyout if you fire him. And there's a decision to make on if you're satisfied with 10 games, which a majority of college football programs would be, but you're Michigan, you're historic, you've won national titles, you've won Big Ten championships. Not in a long time, but you have. Do you try to get back up there and find the person who's going to take down Penn State and Michigan State and Ohio State consistently and put you in a position to make the CFP?
Yeah, that's the question, because there's number one, I don't think there's a lot of guys that can do that. I mean, you're talking about the 0.1% of coaches that are actually capable of doing that. But you're right, this is Michigan. Look, they're going to end up in the Citrus Bowl losing to Florida again this year, but that's neither here nor there. That's going to be so interesting, especially if Ohio State just blitzes Michigan at the Big House. I think that's going to be interesting. So I did have a question for you about that 2014 national championship year, because your team won the inaugural college football playoff and it's still at 4 teams. Do you like the current 4-team format? Would you like to see some expansion to 6, 8? Of course, 12 was even thrown out this offseason. What would be your ideal playoff number?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I guess now, after the way that this college football season has shaped up, I sound like a dummy in hindsight, but my belief, and I think once people are over kind of this COVID hangover and the lack of development and some of the weird things that went on in college football a year ago that spilled over into this year, I think it gets back to more of the same. But if you look at the college football playoff, since its inception, there are only a handful of programs that have actually been in it. Ohio State's been in it multiple times. Clemson's been in it multiple times. Obviously, Alabama. You got Oklahoma making appearances. LSU won the thing a few years ago, but outside of that, you're looking at a Florida State, you're looking at Notre Dame, you're looking at a Washington team that's made it. There's not a lot of programs that have actually been in the thing. Oregon made it the year that we played them in the national championship game, but really outside of that, it's been a handful of teams that are running college football. And so when you talk about expansion, you have to talk about it from the student athlete well-being standpoint. And I know a lot of these conversations happen with the almighty dollar, right, as a frame of reference, because this thing makes athletic departments rich. This thing makes television networks rich. Myself being in the television business, I'm really starting to understand how this thing works. It is lucrative for a lot of people. But if you're a student athlete, once you get to the end of the year, this is what happens is depending on school schedules, but I can remember being in finals week, preparing to play in a Big Ten championship game. Right. So I'm pulling all-nighters, and then I got to go back to the facility and make sure that I'm on point for practice so we can go out and win a game on a Saturday. And then you get to bowl practice when a lot of students are going home and they're spending time with families over that winter period. Student athletes, specifically football players, basketball players do it too, and some other sports, but they're on campus and they're training and they're working out and they're practicing. And now you're asking more teams to do that, potentially miss that time at home and that rest that they need in between semesters to play in a game that they're ultimately going to lose. And then the timing becomes a question, because the year that we played in the college football playoff, the first week of the semester was the week of the game. Right. So we're preparing for a new semester and trying to get used to professors and look over the syllabus and all that kind of stuff. while also preparing to play the biggest game of our career. And the schedule probably extends a little bit further than that. And so now you're asking players to go from playing all through basically before school starts to practicing up through the fall semester. And then you're asking them not to go home at all, and then potentially be 2 or 3 weeks into their spring semester before they actually get a break from their sport. And then they're going to have to go into spring ball and everything else. It's a tough ask, right? So get all that out the way. If we were to expand it, my perfect system is 6 teams with the top 2 seeds getting a bye, because it's competitive to make sure that you can be in a position to be one of those 2 teams that doesn't have to play in the first round. Then you get probably more competitive matchups in 3 versus 6 and 4 versus 5. And I think that there's an opportunity to probably do those on campus, just to add a little bit of an incentive to be one of the top 4 still, because then you get a home game. And I think it creates competitive games. It creates an expanded situation. I think it creates a competitive environment throughout the season to be one of the top 6. But I also believe that you have to do something to celebrate the other New Year's 6 games and some of the other bowl games, because one of the things that has been forgotten in this conversation about playoff expansion is if you're a MAC team who their whole goal all year is to just win 6, nobody's talking about what that means for that program.
Yep.
If it's a program that won 2 or 3 games the year before, and now they've won, 6, 7, or 8 games, it was a big year for them. Nobody gives a damn about what they're doing during bowl season. And I think that's really tough, because that is a majority of the teams that actually make a bowl game are the teams that are happy to be there, and it means something that they can hang a banner in the facility for winning the, Meineke Car Care Bowl or whatever the hell it is. And so I think that's something that also needs to be considered as well, as we think about college football from the lens of, the Ohio States and the Alabamas, or even the Penn States and the Michigans that are really on the cusp of being one of those teams to break through, instead of thinking about the Central Michigan or thinking about, one of the schools from the Sun Belt that's probably never going to make a college football playoff. What does bowl season actually mean to them?
Yeah, I appreciate you breaking that down. I'm one of those people that think a 4-team playoff is just fine, and if we have to expand, I'm with you 6, partially because of the disparity you kind of talked about between 1 and 2, and then kind of the rest. I think last year was kind of a good example of that, where it turns out you could have just played Ohio State and Alabama in the national championship, but I think you're right. I think money's going to drive it, and it will expand whether we want it to or not. But I really appreciate your perspective as a former student athlete on that too. I think that's definitely a viewpoint that's not talked about quite enough. What would be your highlight as an Ohio State Buckeye? And for the sake of the question, I'm going to remove the college football playoff and the national championship, just so you have to pick a different game that might have been one of your favorites.
2015 against Michigan. So the context to that is we're returning a team that's supposed to repeat. And we had obviously a bunch of really good players on that team, and we were confident. And we had our ups and downs through the season. I think that we won some games unconvincingly, but we always felt like we would have the opportunity to be back in it. Get to my senior day, we're playing Michigan State in that sloppy ass weather in the Horseshoe, my last game that I played in Ohio Stadium. And we lost on a last second field goal to an offense that was playing their second and third quarterbacks in a sloppy game where everything that probably could have gone wrong went wrong. And I think that a lot of our issues throughout the season, just in terms of team chemistry and in terms of personalities, probably all came to a head in that game. And so we had a decision to make, because we knew at that point college football playoff is out of the conversation, and now it's going to be beat your rival, no Big Ten championship, and then play in a New Year's 6 bowl game. We had to make a decision on how committed we were to finishing that thing off properly. And we went up to Michigan, the top 10 matchup. It was Jim Harbaugh's first year, and we beat the piss out of them. Scores like 42-13 or something. And so I really appreciated the way that our team responded to that, and the pride that we took in making sure that we could finish off a 4-year run of beating Michigan for the seniors that were there, and do it the right way. In a team in Michigan that had a lot of intrigue and a lot of hype. If you remember Harbaugh's first year, they were a very solid team. I think their only loss up to that point was to Michigan State on some last second special teams issues. And that's one of my favorite calls on a football game,
my gosh.
to be completely honest. But
Same.
that was big. And then to go and play Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl. And that is one of those games where the aerial shot is amazing because you've got two of the most storied programs with the golden domes and the Buckeye leaves from up top. Like, that shot is absolutely beautiful. And we handled them. And I think it was the grit from our team to not have guys opt out and to not have guys take it lightly. And, going out to Arizona, we could have been, at Bottled Blonde Scottsdale all week getting wasted. And we decided we were going to practice hard and ultimately win a football game.
Yeah. Well, I think Ezekiel Elliott is still running through that defense as we speak right now. So that was a good one. So I guess kind of last question. I don't know if it's really a question, but last question for you. Speaking of those 2014, 2015 years, you talked about a podcast you have with Christian Hackenberg. You've also got a podcast called the Glory Days podcast. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's an awesome project that we embarked on, and we're hoping to turn it into a little bit of a franchise. But this guy named Chris Caldwell, based out of New York, who used to work in media, came to me with this idea. He's an Ohio State grad, and he said, what do you think about telling the story of 2014? And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, nobody's really done it before, and it's a really intriguing story. What do you think about telling it? I'm like, I think it'd be a lot of fun. He said, I got this idea to do a long form storytelling podcast series about that season. I'm trying to find the guys to do it. So obviously we hooked up and we talked logistics and everything. And they said, we need a co-host for that season. Who are you thinking? And I think it would have been unique to try to get a Braxton, a Cardale, or a JT. But I think it's also tough for any of them to tell that story because their perspectives are so unique on it, being the guys who are kind of in the center of what was going on offensively that year. And so I said, well, I got a guy in Columbus who played wide receiver. He's a sharp ass dude. And, he's a Buckeye through and through. He's like, who are you thinking about? I said, Evan Spencer.
Yeah.
It was perfect because, Evan's dad was a running back and a coach at Ohio State. And Evan was a really good player, was a team captain on that team. And so we started putting it together. And what was really unique for us is as we started mapping out our show sheets and the topics and the content, a lot of memories really started coming back. And so it became something, obviously it was always going to be a personal story, but it became something that we really internalized because we started having the memories, both good and bad, about what transpired that year. So we sat down and we just started mapping out and recording episodes. And we must have had between 10 episodes that we released, I would say 25 hours of really good content that we had to pare down so we could release it all. And so our idea is obviously this story that we've done, but we think this is a marketable tool that we can take to other schools and other fan bases and say, hey, what do you think about telling your story about whatever championship run it was or about their, against all odds type of situation. And there's something that we can also morph into other types of media as well. But for us, it was super fun to relive the moments, but also to invite people back in so they could relive them too. There's not a day I go through Columbus and somebody would recognize me and talk about that season and the memories that they had and how much it meant to them. I had a wonderful guy in here working on a project in my house today. And before he left, he said, if I'm working on somebody's house and I recognize them, I usually don't like to say anything. But I got to tell you, thank you for the memories that you helped me create while you were at Ohio State. And so this project is our ability to help people relive some of those moments. And we did it in a really fun, unique way.
That's awesome. Well, I would encourage all of our listeners to go check out that podcast. Again, it's the Glory Days podcast, and I assume that's available on all of the usual podcast platforms. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Joshua, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was just such a pleasure to talk Ohio State football and Big Ten and everything else. Thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.